The dust never truly settles in Oakhaven. It just waits for the next storm to stir it up. Most people in this county knew the sheriff, Elias Thorne, was a man who measured justice by the thickness of a man's wallet. He ruled the local precinct like a feudal lord, extracting fines from anyone who didn't fit his mold. But when he rolled his cruiser onto the Miller farm, expecting another easy payday from an old man who spent his days tending to heirloom corn, he didn't realize he was trespassing on more than just private property. He was walking into a trap set by history itself. Elias Thorne didn't know it yet, but he was about to lose everything. To understand why this specific confrontation would become the focal point of a county-wide collapse, you have to understand the geography of greed. Oakhaven was a town bypassed by the modern highway system, effectively leaving it to stew in its own isolation. The economy was stagnant, and in such environments, power abhors a vacuum. Sheriff Thorne had filled that vacuum with a brand of corruption that was brazen, surgical, and terrifyingly efficient. He had deputies who acted less like law enforcement and more like collection agents, ensuring that every local business owner paid their protection tax. Arthur Miller, on the other hand, was a relic. He was a man of the soil, a farmer whose family had worked that specific stretch of land since before the county lines were even drawn on a map. Arthur was quiet, bordering on reclusive. He didn't participate in town hall meetings, he didn't run for the school board, and he certainly didn't pay the illicit fees that Thorne demanded from everyone else. To the town, Arthur was an anomaly, an untouchable figure who seemed to exist outside of Thorne's jurisdiction, not because he was powerful, but because he was irrelevant. That perceived irrelevance was Thorne's greatest miscalculation. The friction began, as most things do in small towns, over a technicality. Thorne had been eyeing the Miller farm for months. It wasn't about the corn, it was about the water rights attached to the property. A regional developer had been whispering in Thorne's ear about a luxury residential project that required access to the Miller Creek, a resource that could turn a bankrupt farmer's land into a goldmine. Thorne saw an opportunity to enrich himself, satisfy the developer, and eliminate the last holdout in his territory. He didn't just want to take the land, he wanted to humiliate Arthur in the process. He needed to prove that nobody in Oakhaven was beyond his reach. The strategy was classic intimidation: create a series of fabricated code violations, levy impossible fines, and then seize the property for non-payment. It was a well-oiled machine that had worked a dozen times before. But Arthur Miller wasn't just a farmer. In his younger years, before he retreated to the quiet life of the fields, Arthur had been something else entirely. He had a past that was buried deeper than the roots of his oldest oaks. He had learned, through a lifetime of difficult lessons, that when a wolf comes for your flock, you don't bargain with it. You don't try to reason with it. You dismantle it. As the weeks leading up to the incident unfolded, the tension in the county reached a fever pitch. Thorne started showing up at the farm daily, his heavy boots crushing the rows of seedlings, his voice booming with forced authority. Each visit was a performance for the benefit of his deputies, a display of dominance intended to wear Arthur down psychologically. Arthur remained silent. He watched. He listened. He meticulously documented every single transgression, every unauthorized entry, every threat, every moment of harassment. He was building a wall, brick by metaphorical brick. The townspeople watched from a distance, terrified. They saw the sheriff's escalating behavior and assumed it was only a matter of time before Arthur surrendered. They didn't see the calm, calculated look in Arthur's eyes during those confrontations. They didn't understand that Arthur was treating the sheriff exactly like a pest that had infested his crop. He was simply waiting for the right moment to apply the cure. The stage was set. It was a clear, dry Tuesday afternoon when Thorne decided to force the final hand. He arrived with an eviction order he had hand-signed himself, flanked by his two most loyal, and most brutal, deputies. He had the intent of clearing the property by sundown. He wasn't just coming to serve papers, he was coming to take possession, by force if necessary. As the cruiser crunched onto the gravel driveway, Arthur stood on his porch. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't shout. He simply held a thermos of coffee, watching the dust kick up behind the vehicle, marking the arrival of a man who was about to step off a ledge he didn't know existed. The confrontation on the porch lasted less than 3 minutes, but it carried the weight of a decade of suppressed rage. Sheriff Thorne stepped out of his vehicle, his hand resting habitually on the grip of his sidearm. He was sweating, not from the heat, but from the adrenaline of the power trip. "Mr. Miller," he barked, his voice echoing across the open fields. "Time's up. You've had your warnings. This property is now under temporary seizure for outstanding county liens. You have 10 minutes to clear the house." Arthur didn't flinch. He set his coffee cup down on the porch railing with a deliberate, slow motion that made Thorne's deputies twitchy. "The liens are fraudulent, Elias," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly steady. "And you know it. You've forged the signatures of the county auditor, and you've bypassed the judicial review process. You aren't here to enforce the law, you're here to commit grand larceny." Thorne laughed, a guttural, dismissive sound. "Who's going to stop me? The judge? He plays golf with the developer I'm working for. The state police? They haven't been in this county in 3 years. You're alone, Arthur. You're a footnote in a town that's about to move on without you." Thorne signaled his deputies. They moved toward the porch, hands on their holsters, ready to transition from bureaucratic intimidation to physical violence. But as they reached the first step, Arthur stepped aside, opening the front door wide. He didn't cower, he gestured inside, as if inviting them to a feast. "You want the land, Elias?" Arthur asked, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "It's all here. Every single piece of evidence you thought you had destroyed. Every bribe you've taken, every phone call you've made to your developer friends, and every time you've looked into that camera over there." Thorne froze. He looked up toward the eaves of the porch. A small, high-definition security camera, one he hadn't noticed because it was painted to match the weather-beaten wood, was blinking with a steady, clinical blue light. The air in the yard shifted instantly. The bravado that had fueled Thorne for years evaporated. This wasn't just a farmer with a shotgun, this was a man who had been playing a long game of entrapment. Arthur had been running a private, high-fidelity server in his basement for months, feeding the feed into a remote, off-site cloud system that Thorne couldn't touch. "You see," Arthur continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low register, "the law is a funny thing. It's written on paper, but it's enforced by people. And people can be bought. But data? Data is cold. It doesn't care about your golf games or your local power structures. It just is." Thorne lunged forward, his face contorted in a mask of panic. He reached for his radio to call for backup, to call for anyone who could help him scrub the scene, but his hand stopped midair. A low hum filled the air, the sound of a drone hovering just above the tree line. Then, a second one joined it. From the surrounding woods, Arthur's friends, not farmers, but retired forensic accountants and a disgraced investigative journalist he had befriended years ago, stepped out from the tree line. They weren't armed with rifles, they were armed with live stream equipment and a direct uplink to the state attorney general's office. Thorne realized with a sickening thud that this wasn't just a property dispute. It was a sting operation. The main content of this shift was the collapse of Thorne's psychological infrastructure. He had spent his entire career operating under the assumption that he was the apex predator of Oakhaven. Now, he was the prey. He realized that the evidence he thought he was going to seize was actually the weight that would bury him. Arthur began to list the crimes, not as a victim, but as a prosecutor. He recited the dates, the amounts, and the specific names of the shell companies Thorne had used to hide his kickbacks. With every sentence, a deputy took a step back, distancing themselves from their boss. They saw the writing on the wall, they saw the live-streamed feed on a tablet held by one of the witnesses, showing the entire town council, and the state police, watching the confession in real time. The contrast between the two men was stark. Thorne, the man of law, was trembling, his badge looking more like a target than a symbol of authority. Arthur, the outcast, was the embodiment of calm, orderly justice. The farmer hadn't used a single bullet, yet he had effectively ended the sheriff's life as he knew it. The power dynamic had flipped in seconds. Thorne tried to salvage the situation with a desperate threat. Drawing his service weapon, but the click of a dozen camera shutters and the realization that he was surrounded by witnesses paralyzed him. He was a man who had built a kingdom on the assumption that secrets stay buried. He hadn't accounted for a man who knew how to plant things, and how to make sure they grew into something that could tear down the very structures designed to crush him. As the sirens finally wailed in the distance, not for Arthur, but for the sheriff, the realization hit Thorne with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't just lost his job or his reputation, he had lost the illusion of his own untouchability. The farmer had won, not by playing the game, but by burning the board. The fall of Elias Thorne was not a sudden explosion, it was a slow, agonizing dismantling. As the state police cruisers finally crested the ridge, their lights cutting through the late afternoon gloom, the environment of Oakhaven changed forever. Thorne, once the undisputed monarch of the county, stood motionless in the center of the Miller driveway. The handcuffs that were being placed on his wrists weren't the cheap, plastic ties he used for petty detainees, they were cold, steel, federal-grade restraints. What followed in the days after the arrest was a masterclass in institutional housecleaning. The evidence Arthur had painstakingly harvested wasn't merely incriminating, it was radioactive. Because Arthur had documented the systemic nature of the corruption, the investigation didn't stop at Thorne. It acted like a thread pulled from a cheap sweater, unraveling the entire local government. The developer Thorne had been colluding with. He was picked up before he could finish his morning espresso. The city council members who had looked the other way. They were brought in for questioning, their bank records laid bare for the first time in years. This section of our story highlights the mechanics of the aftermath. It is the contrast between the chaotic, corrupt silence Thorne had enforced and the clinical, loud transparency that replaced it. Arthur Miller hadn't just saved his farm, he had triggered a fiscal and moral audit of an entire municipality. People often assume that justice in small towns is a matter of who you know. Thorne had bet his life on that assumption. He thought that by controlling the sheriff's department, he controlled the flow of information. But he completely underestimated the digital age's capacity for permanent record-keeping. Arthur, despite his rustic appearance, had spent his retirement years mastering data security and blockchain-based logging. Every document Thorne had altered had a digital timestamp that couldn't be faked. As the investigators pored over the evidence, they found that Thorne's empire was built on a series of paper-only transactions. He had created a massive discrepancy between what was reported to the state and what was actually happening on the ground, a perfect, illicit parallel to the silver market dynamics that keep the real, physical value hidden behind layers of paper derivatives. Just as paper-silver contracts can balloon to represent phantom metal that doesn't exist, Thorne's paper authority had created a phantom law that collapsed the moment someone demanded physical delivery, or, in this case, physical proof. Arthur sat on his porch during the long, humid nights that followed, watching the town change. It was a strange, hollow victory. The townspeople, who had once cowered in fear, now approached the farm with a mix of awe and trepidation. They looked at Arthur as if he were a revolutionary, a man who had single-handedly broken a spell. But Arthur didn't want to be a revolutionary. He wanted to be a farmer. The contrast between the two lives, Thorne's desperate need for public adoration and power versus Arthur's absolute indifference to it, was the central theme of the legal proceedings. During the depositions, Thorne tried to paint himself as a victim of a technological setup. He argued that Arthur had manipulated the situation. The prosecutors, however, simply played the raw, unedited footage. There was no manipulation. There was only the truth, captured in 4K, and that was something Thorne could never argue against. This phase of the story also illustrates the open loop of the legal fallout. While Thorne was behind bars, the town was left to grapple with the realization of how easily they had been controlled. It was a trauma that would linger for years. Schools, businesses, and families had all been touched by the corruption. The Miller incident, as it became known, turned into a cautionary tale taught to every new recruit entering the state police academy: never assume the person standing in the dirt doesn't know more than the person standing in the office. As we look at the core of this conflict, we see that it wasn't about land, or money, or even the law. It was about the arrogance of the state versus the quiet resolve of the individual. Thorne had assumed that his uniform and his badge gave him the right to rewrite the rules of reality. He forgot that reality has a way of asserting itself, regardless of how much paper or how many titles you put in front of it. The main content here is not just the arrest, it is the exposure. The exposure of a fragile system that relied entirely on the ignorance of its participants. Once Arthur provided the light, the system couldn't survive. The shadows where Thorne thrived were stripped away, leaving only the stark, uncomfortable reality of his actions. This is what high-retention storytelling relies on, the moment the villain realizes that their entire world is based on a lie, and the hero, who has known the truth all along, simply watches it fall apart. By the time the legal dust settled, the Miller farm was more than a home. It was a monument to the idea that patience, when paired with preparation, is the most potent weapon a man can have. Thorne was gone, sentenced to decades in a facility where he no longer held the keys, while Arthur remained. He went back to his corn. He went back to the quiet, predictable, and honest rhythm of the seasons. The sheriff had crossed the wrong farmer, and he paid the ultimate price, not in blood, but in the total, humiliating erasure of his own relevance. We have watched the sheriff fall from grace, and we have seen the systematic dismantling of his corrupt empire, but a question remains that haunts the town of Oakhaven: was Arthur Miller truly acting alone, or was he merely the tip of a much larger, more sophisticated spear? Think back to those drones hovering over the tree line. In a town bypassed by modern infrastructure, where did a reclusive farmer acquire high-end surveillance technology, forensic-grade encryption, and a direct uplink to the state attorney general? The narrative the public received was that of a solitary hero, but the real story, the one hidden beneath the surface of the official police report, points to something far more intricate. There is a loose thread here, one that keeps the legal scholars and the local conspiracy theorists awake at night. If you look closely at the logs recovered from Arthur's servers, there are encrypted signatures from international IP addresses. This implies that the Miller incident was not a local skirmish, but a test case. Was the sheriff simply a pawn in a larger experiment regarding the limits of local authoritarian control? Did someone, somewhere, want to see how quickly a corrupt system would collapse when hit with precise, data-driven pressure? Consider this: why did the state attorney general's office respond within minutes? In a system usually bogged down by bureaucracy, that speed suggests a prearranged protocol. An open loop exists regarding the involvement of these external entities. If Arthur was being assisted, then who were his backers, and what was their endgame? Was it pure justice, or was it a calculated strike to reorganize the local power dynamics for a future purpose? We also have to look at the developer. Thorne was colluding with a regional powerhouse, a massive entity that doesn't just fold because one sheriff goes to prison. That developer disappeared from the public record shortly after the arrest. Did they pay a fine? Did they cut a deal with the state? Or did they simply pivot to a new town, a new sheriff, and a new target? The vacuum left by Thorne wasn't just a political void, it was a resource-rich environment that someone else is likely trying to claim right now. And what about the town itself? The Miller incident created a culture of suspicion. Every local official is now looked at with the same distrust that toppled Thorne. This creates a state of perpetual paralysis in local government. Is this actually better for the citizens, or has the pendulum swung too far in the other direction, where nothing gets done because everyone is terrified of being the next target of an Arthur Miller-style takedown? There is an even deeper mystery: the vault. During the final weeks of the investigation, rumors surfaced that Thorne wasn't just taking bribes in cash. He was rumored to be stockpiling physical assets, precious metals, historical deeds, and untraceable wealth, stashed in locations that have yet to be discovered. If that vault exists, the contents are currently sitting in the shadows, waiting for the statute of limitations to expire or for the right person to come along and claim the inheritance of a fallen tyrant. Think about the implications of the paper versus physical reality we discussed earlier. Thorne's entire life was a paper construct of influence. When he was forced to deliver the physical reality of his actions, he went bankrupt. But if that hidden wealth exists, it is the only physical thing left of his legacy. Is it still sitting in a concrete bunker somewhere under the county, or was it already seized by the friends who helped Arthur? The most unsettling open loop is Arthur himself. He retreated back to his farm, back to his corn, and back to his silence. But he is a man who now knows exactly how to identify, track, and destroy a power structure. If he did it once, what stops him from doing it again? Or, more importantly, what stops others from coming to his porch to learn his methods? The Miller method has become a blueprint. In an era where trust in institutions is at an all-time low, the idea that a single individual can render a corrupt sheriff obsolete is the most dangerous, and most empowering, story in the country. Is the town of Oakhaven truly free, or is it just waiting for the next sheriff to come along and try to squeeze the remaining blood from the stone? And as for Arthur, is he the hero who saved the town, or is he a permanent, quiet monitor, keeping a watchful eye on the local government, ready to launch a drone the moment he sees the first sign of rot? The story of the sheriff and the farmer is not an isolated event. It is a recurring cycle. The only thing that changes is the technology, the tactics, and the amount of data left behind. We are living in a world where the power dynamic between the governors and the governed is being rewritten in real time. Thorne lost because he played by the old rules. The next one might not be so foolish. The story of the sheriff and the farmer is more than just a local scandal, it is a mirror reflecting the fundamental fragility of modern power. We have explored the fall of a man who thought he was untouchable and the rise of a man who proved that secrets are only as safe as the paper they are written on. But now, we must turn this lens onto you. The most important engagement tactic in high-retention storytelling is the identification principle. You aren't just a viewer of this story, you are a participant in a world where the same dynamics of paper versus physical reality are playing out in our banks, our markets, and our governing bodies every single day. I want you to drop a comment below right now. If you were in Arthur Miller's shoes, watching a system designed to protect you begin to target you, what is the first step you would take? Would you choose the quiet, digital surveillance path that Arthur took, or would you go straight to the light of public scrutiny? Furthermore, I am challenging the market watchers in this community. We've established that the sheriff's downfall was his reliance on a paper reality that couldn't stand up to physical verification. This is the exact same tension we see in the silver market today. The discrepancy between the paper futures contracts and the actual, physical inventory sitting in the vaults is the sheriff's forged lien of our modern economy. Check the pinned comment below. I've posted a poll. Do you believe the Miller method of data-driven transparency is the most effective way to fight systemic corruption, or is it too risky to attempt? For those who want to see how this translates into the current commodities landscape, I've linked a secondary video in the description that breaks down the COMEX registered to eligible ratios. It is the real-world, financial version of the Miller farm confrontation. If you are tired of the paper world and want to stay informed about the physical reality, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We are currently tracking 3 other, Thorne-style, institutional collapses happening across the country, and you won't want to miss the breakdowns. You are tired of the paper world and want to stay informed about the physical reality, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We are currently tracking 3 other, Thorne-style, institutional collapses happening across the country, and you won't want to miss the breakdowns. This story needs to be seen by anyone who still believes that their local government is immune to accountability. Share this video with one person who needs to be reminded that the little guy is often much, much faster than the machine. As we close this chapter on the Sheriff of Oakhaven, remember that the most dangerous thing you can be in this society is a nobody who has done their homework. Arthur Miller was a farmer, but he was also a student of the system. He understood that a man with a plan and a bit of data is more powerful than a man with a badge and a megaphone. The ultimate price Thorne paid wasn't just his job, it was his identity. He became a cautionary tale, a ghost story told to power trippers everywhere to remind them that the ground is always shifting beneath their feet. Stay vigilant. The next sheriff is already out there, and he's probably already writing his own liens. Don't be the one who waits for the cruiser to pull into the driveway. Be the one who is already recording, already prepared, and already waiting. Thank you for being part of this investigation. If you found value in this breakdown of power, logic, and the ultimate cost of greed, please let me know by hitting that like button. It helps the algorithm push this truth to people who are currently being lied to by their own local officials. We will be back next week with a new case study. Until then, keep your records, keep your eyes open, and keep your physical reality in check. The paper world is falling, and those who prepared for the physical reality are the ones who will remain standing when the dust finally, truly, settles.